The story of the blind man given sight by Jesus this morning, read by Henry and Peter, is filled with themes of light and seeing and sight that are expressed, quite honestly, throughout the whole Gospel of John. In its own profound and simple way, it illustrates and illumines the paradox of the blind seeing while those who have sight cannot see. It is a story demonstrating, I would posit to you this morning, how our own dogmas blind us to the miraculous living presence of Christ in the world. It is a story that if we really take it seriously, really paid attention to it, it probably would upset us. It should disorient us in a way because it challenges the very basis of how we construct, how we see the world, most especially in terms of our own deeply held religious identities. The story asks us, who is really blind here? And it starts off innocent enough. Jesus is walking along, and he sees a man that we are told is blind from birth. Our opening seems almost arbitrary, as if Jesus is strolling along with his disciples, and he notices this blind man on the side of the road. And it strikes me that the very first seeing in this story is Jesus who sees, truly sees, a blind beggar that most of us would probably just pass along without even noticing. And then Jesus' disciples turn to him and ask him a rather odd question. It seems arbitrary, doesn't it? Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? In an odd way, it's apparent that the disciples see not the man, but see a theological problem. And this is the first brush with a reoccurring issue for those in this story of seeing the world through their own dogmas. Now, dogma is defined as a set of principles or rules often laid down for us by those in authority that are often understood as inconvertibly true. They're articles of faith that shape how we see the world and the way it works, and even how God is supposed to work in the world. Now, we often associate dogmas with religious belief, and there is that. They show up there for sure. But our dogmas don't necessarily have to be religious. Those things we believe about the world to be unquestionable and unarguable, that are so true for us, whether we think of them in terms of political or social or even personal ways. While dogmas can be an essential way to make sense of the world around us, they also, I would argue, in the point of this story, blind us to the world. So the question the disciples asked Jesus is rooted in a religious dogma, that people who are crippled or lame or broken in some way, blind in this case, must be so because they must have sinned some way. That's the dogma. That's how you make sense of the world. Why would human suffering occur if it wasn't your fault? The disciples of Jesus are interested in his opinion on whether it was this blind man, blind from birth, whether it was his fault or that of his parents that resulted in that blindness. Now, they don't question the dogma that the man is blind because of sin. Now, it'd be easy to judge them rather harshly, to kind of dismiss them as superstitious folk, kind of dismiss them for their dogmatic way of seeing, if we still didn't have that dogma as part of the way in which we engage the world these days. When we see suffering, and we often associate that suffering as a result of someone's sin. people who are poor, because they make sinful choices, wrong moral choices, or aren't just willing to do the work so that they wouldn't be poor. It's their fault. People of color are suffering because they don't do the right things or make the right choices. It's their fault. Racism is essentially a dogma. But Jesus, when he looks at the blind man, the man blind from birth, doesn't see a dogma, he sees a human being. And he challenges the dogma of his disciples by saying it was neither the man nor his parents who sinned. Jesus tells them what you can't see is this is a human being whom God does miraculous things. When Jesus looked at the blind man, he saw the miracle of God. And it makes me wonder how different would we be if we saw each other in the same eyes in which Jesus saw, I would guess, every human being he encountered, as someone in whom God does miraculous things. And he was always offending the disciples because God would see the miraculous in the most offensive people, particularly according to their dogmas of the world. And so Jesus heals the man blind from birth. What is interesting about this story is that people cannot believe the miracle, even though it's right there. They can't believe it with their very own eyes. Not the neighbors who can't believe the blind beggar they saw on the street every day is the same man who stands before him seeing. Not the Pharisees who cannot believe Jesus could do such a thing. Not even this man's parents, the blind man's parents, who will not testify on his behalf for fear they'll be kicked out of the synagogue for not having the right dogma. No one in this story really sees the miracle because their dogmas prevent them from seeing them. And I think the Pharisees are an interesting part of this story because their resistance to the miraculous healing of this blind man is rooted in a deep, true dogma of their faith. That healing cannot be from God, that healing cannot be from God because it was done on the Sabbath. Now, we might find that silly in our own modern 21st century minds. We might be puzzled by this as we don't really understand that for the Jewish people, Sabbath keeping is an essential tenet of their faith. Keeping the Sabbath is what defined them as faithful people. So this wasn't some silly theological debate for them. It was at the core of their identity, to be people who keep the Sabbath. They wrestled with that question. Is it right for this to happen on the Sabbath? Is it not right? That was central to what made them different in the world and to what God expected from them. It isn't just a dogma, it is at the very heart of their identity. And what's challenging is that identity rooted in that dogma limits what they can see and not see, what God can do and what God cannot do, that God is here and God is not here. And they're not alone. We do the very same thing. This past week I got to be on a Zoom. God knows I do Zoom way more than I like, but this one was kind of fun as I got to listen to one of my favorite theologians named Dr. Darrell Guder. And he made an observation in his conversation, almost an offhand observation, that really kind of stuck with me this week. He argued that the Bible is filled with our human attempts to reduce God to something we can control. And I was struck by that. Being a rather, I hate to admit, control freak myself, it struck me that is true, that it's filled with stories of us humans trying to reduce God to something that we can control. And Guter's argument is that the sin of the church and of any religious faith, any religious dogma, is our reductionism of God to something we can fully grasp and label as God. And we all do it every day. We might reduce God to some idea of success, or we might reduce God to some simple question of my personal salvation, or we might reduce God to something about my own survival. And the challenge, Guter argues, is that God, especially in Jesus Christ, refuses to be reduced to a dogma. Which then raises an unsettling question for us all. How do our own dogmas about God, about reducing God to some sense of something we can control, about the world way the world is supposed to be, in what way does our kind of reduction of God to a dogma hinder our ability to see the miraculous? There's a purported quote from Albert Einstein that is one of my favorites. He was supposed to have said, he said this, that there are only two ways to live your life. One is as though nothing is a miracle. The other is as though everything is a miracle. And it is the irony of this story that in the end, it's only the man who was born blind from birth who really sees Jesus for the miracle he is. He sees what others cannot see. And maybe we are to see ourselves in that man blind from birth, to recognize our own blindness, and yet to encounter a Christ and know his healing love and grace, and then to leave behind the dogmas that we want to control God and the world in, and see the world with new eyes. We are the blind man, blind from birth, because we're all blind. Now, there is this line at the beginning of the story, you may not, it was just kind of inserted at the beginning of the story. It seems almost arbitrary, in which Jesus asserts he is the light of the world. And that's a metaphor, not surprisingly, we find over and over in the Gospel of John. It's at the very first chapter. Jesus, the Logos, is the light of the world. And Richard Rohr points out something that's interesting, that light is not so much something we see directly, if you think about it. It's not something we see, photons of light. As light is that by which we see everything else. Without light, we cannot see. And so Rohr asserts that the living Christ as our light is not reduced to some dogma that we control, but becomes the very light by which we see everything else. Christ is our light, who calls us to see what others refuse to see because of their dogmas. We are called to see the neighbor, not through our dogma, but through the light of Christ. We are called to see the hurting and the in pain in persons different from us, persons we would consider other. We're called to see through the light of Christ and not through our dogmas. And we're called to choose to live our lives each and every day, eyes wide open, seeking in that light of Christ the truth, that if only we pay attention, the truth is everything is a miracle. To God be the glory this day and forevermore. Amen.